This afternoon, our moderator is Professor Wick Murray. Graduated from Yale University in 1963 with honors in history and enlisted with the United States Air Force. Before returning to Yale, he received his PhD in military diplomatic history, completed a tour of Southeast Asia with the 314th Tactical Airlift Wing. After 2 years in the Yale History Department, Professor Murray moved to Ohio State University as a military and diplomatic historian, where he was awarded the Alumni Distinguished Teaching Award in 1987. He has taught at many other distinguished institutions, most recently serving as a senior fellow in the Institute of Defense Analysis and as a member of the National Strategic Studies Group. He is widely published and has collaborated on countless other books and articles. Several of his major works include Strategy for Defeat, the Luftwaffe, 1933 to 1944, The Change in the European Balance of Power, 1938 to 39, The Path of Ruin, Luftwaffe, 1933-34, German Military Effectiveness, Air Operation Report, Gulf War Air Power Survey, Air War in the Persian Gulf, and Air War 1914 to 1945. It's my pleasure at this time to present to you Dr. Williamson Wick Murray. Dr. Murray.
I have a few opening remarks. Let me first introduce the panel members and do a much shorter job of it than my introduction, not because I want to short the panel members, but I think we want to give the audience maximum time. On my immediate right is Don Miller, who's been on 450 panels over the last 2 days and should certainly be known to everybody. Next to him is Richard Frank, who served with the 101st Airborne Division in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. Became a lawyer upon his return, practiced law for the U.S. government until very recently, and on his own time with, quote, no training in graduate school, which shows how useful training in graduate school is, published, I think, the two best books on the Pacific War that I've ever read, Guadalcanal and Downfall. And he will be commenting, obviously, on the bombing of Japan. And then to his right is a good old friend, Conrad Crane, served in the United States Army, taught at military history at West Point and at the Army War College, and has ended up, to the great enthusiasm of those of us who know him and the institution, as the head of the U.S. Army's Military History Institute at Carlisle. Really a wonderfully distinguished panel. Let me welcome you all to what might be called the German and Japanese Urban Renewal Panel. Let me make a few opening remarks. In these days of political correctness, in which precision bombing to the millimeter is at least the claim of our Air Forces, Naval, Marine, and United States Air Force, the strategic bombing campaign of World War II certainly looks like a very dismal, bloody affair. And indeed, it was. It killed men, women, and children by the bucketful. It ravaged and destroyed the great medieval cities of Central Europe. And it was, in the end, a merciless, brutal, and horrific way to wage war. But it was also absolutely essential to the winning of the Second World War and the peace that followed that conflict. It severely distorted the defense of the Reich. In 1944, no less than 20,000 high-velocity cannons were firing huge amounts of ammunition, by and large missing their targets, into the skies of the Reich. Somewhere around 500,000 German soldiers were involved in that effort. And as Max Hastings has pointed out, virtually the whole of the Luftwaffe had been pulled in from the frontiers of the Reich in July 1943 to defend the Reich itself. It kept a severe lid on German production. It provided a crucial psychological lift in 1941-1942. It gained air superiority over all of Europe by May 1944. And the transportation plans in Normandy and against the German economy in 1944 and 1945 played a major role in eventual German defeat. In the Pacific, the strategic bombing offensive, I think, presents, as Max Hastings is arguing in his, or will argue in his new book, Nemesis, was one of the contributing factors to, if you will, the final recognition by an obdurate, fanatical Japanese military leadership that, should they continue the war, they were going to take down their entire nation to destruction, and they would get scant honor in so doing. Let me present first Dr. Miller with his discussion of the destruction of Berlin.
Well, Wick saved me a lot of time by setting that background beautifully. An additional point to be emphasized here is that strategic bombing doesn't really begin, strategic bombing against Germany doesn't really begin in earnest until after D-Day, after mastery of the air has been achieved. And then the Allied Anglo-American Air Forces went after the two targets that really and eventually disabled the German economic war machine. Those targets were transportation, and in destroying the railroads and canal systems, delivery systems in Germany, they destroyed basically the coal system in Germany. And Germany is a coal-run economy. But although fuel powers industry, oil powers the military, and the Allies concomitantly went after oil, beginning just before D-Day and continuing right on through until April 1945, until German production was down to 6% of its former capacity. So 70% of the tonnage that's dropped on Germany in World War II is dropped after July 1st, 1944. Up to that point, with the exception of these enormous air battles that paved the way to D-Day, strategic bombing was an abysmal failure. And the air crews paid horribly for it. As I mentioned this morning, just the 8th Air Force lost 26,000 men killed in this struggle. And there's no worse way to die than in a spinning fire-consumed airplane. I want to talk about a break that takes place, a moral break, if you will, as well as a strategic break in the way the Americans bombed. We went into this war expecting to engage in pinpoint bombing, and that, of course, turned into an oxymoron. It was impossible to do pinpoint bombing with persistent cloud cover over northwestern Europe, with heavy Luftwaffe anti-aircraft and fighter resistance, and initially with ill-trained crews. And in horrible weather, the Americans bombed through the clouds. They called it radar bombing. The crews more accurately called it blind bombing. Now, blind bombing was fine and could be relatively accurate if you're hitting a place like Leuna, just outside Mersburg, a gigantic oil refinery, a synthetic oil refinery, and it really is an industrial fortress as well, with more anti-aircraft guns rimming it than rim Berlin. You can see it. It's in an open field. There's no population centers nearby. They were hard targets to defeat only because they were well defended. But when you start going after the other target, when you go after transportation systems, you're going to go after marshalling yards, where the Germans marshal these enormous trains filled with coal. And anyone who's been to a European city realizes that the train stations and the marshalling yards are directly in the center of the city. So if you're bombing through the clouds with an accurate radar system called H2X, you might hit your target. But you're also going to do an awful lot of collateral damage. A good way to see this is when a bomber formation goes over a small city. If this is a V like this, and I have a piece of paper up here, and this is the city itself. The formation is so large, let's say 1,100 planes, that the shadow it casts covers the entire city. And at that point in the war, late in the war, not every plane has a Norden bomb sight, a careful bomb aiming sight, a computerized bomb aiming sight. Only the lead planes have, with well-trained crews, lead crews as they're called, have the Norden bomb sight. So everyone else bombs on the leader. When they see a smoke bomb coming out of there, that's the signal, drop. And they become togglers, as they're called. They just pull a toggle and out come the bombs. So when you fly over a city of about 70 or 80,000 people, the lead plane might get a lucky hit and blow out the marshalling yards. Everybody else will blow out the town. And that creates, of course, a moral dilemma. Do you bomb or do you not bomb? You can say that it's the wrong thing to do, but on the other hand, this kind of bombing puts enormous pressure on the Germans, because the Luftwaffe has a very difficult time, its fighter planes flying that high against the bombers in freezing thin air. And breakdowns and accidents, as Wicks pointed out in some of his other works, are one of the leading causes, and not leading cause at this point in the war, of the decline and eventual destruction of the Luftwaffe. So that's the kind of moral dilemma. We're inching close, about the time of the Battle of the Bulge, to British area bombing. Or as one RAF guy told me, he said, you know, you Americans, he said, we area bombed area targets. He said, what you guys did was you area bombed pinpoint targets. Well, it wasn't quite that. The matter of intent is still important. If I live in a neighborhood that is hit by a string of bombs accidentally, the intention of the people in that plane are irrelevant to me, okay? But if I live in a city that's coldly marked out for slaughter, as some of Bomber Harris's planners marked certain cities like Dresden out for firebombing, then the intention of the attacker does become important, you see. So there's still a moral and strategic difference going into the Battle of Bulge, December, January 1945, between British and American bombing. And I think we tipped over toward the British side and helped prepare the way for what happened in Japan with what happened in Berlin on February 3rd, 1945. What happened was this, basically. The Allies were winning the air war and didn't know it. And one reason they didn't know the depth of the destruction they had inflicted on Germany was this cloud cover that settled in over Germany in January 1945, making photo reconnaissance of bomb targets almost impossible. In addition, there are ultra intercepts of German message traffic, but these aren't read until February. In fact, I suspected when I looked at the records that one of the reasons they weren't read is that the Americans were trying to hide the fact that the transportation bombing, which the British favored, was working very well, and they wanted their own oil bombing put on the top burner. But in any event, the mood in the high command is dismal. Now, what started to get me thinking about this was one of the stupidest questions I've ever asked in my life. I asked an Air Force pilot, I said, why did we bomb Dresden so close to the end of the war? And he said, what the hell are you talking about? How did we know it was going to be the end of the war? We just buried the dead of the Battle of the Bulge. And I thought, you've got to see history, you know, and I've always tried to do this, and I was remiss, front to back. So if you look at history front to back, Dresden, Berlin, and a lot of this terror bombing that was done by Americans toward the end of the war is explained by this dark and despondent mood among the American high command. I have the records of the high command in January, and General Anderson, who's second in command of the strategic air forces in Europe, is saying, look, we're going to have to step up this bombing campaign. Our intelligence is indicating that Germans are developing new submarines. with electric motors that can stay submerged for up to 72 hours. That they're going to have jets, which are already flying, that they're going to have jets available to the numbers of about 500 to 600 by the summer, and that could prolong the war. In addition, we'd just taken a big hit at the Battle of the Bulge. There's still some powder in the German gun. So the feeling is, yes, we got to go after the submarine yards. Yes, we've got to go after the jet manufacturing plants, hard as they were to get, since some of them were submerged underground, et cetera. But Anderson also adds, we have to begin draconian measures. The 8th Air Force must begin draconian measures against Germany. Terror bombing that will convince Germans, hopefully, that there's no end, yet the war is not winnable. Well, Carl Spaatz, who headed the Strategic Air Command, does not believe in terror bombing. But he does get reports in January of a gigantic Soviet advance, which is about to begin in mid-January. And once launched, he felt the 8th Air Force had an obligation and a responsibility to aid that advance, because the Americans were still licking their wounds from the Battle of the Bulge and not ready to begin our march to the Rhine. So Spaatz says, I'll agree to this, to a joint British-American targeting committee came up with the idea of hitting places like Berlin, Leipzig, and Dresden, and hitting the rail stations which will be packed with military personnel, but also refugees. Refugees, as Anthony Beevor talks about in his wonderful book on Berlin, that comprised one of the greatest flight migrations in world history. Enormous numbers of Germans coming from the Eastern Reich and fleeing into Berlin, 10,000, 11,000 a day, fleeing the Red Army. The idea was then that this bombing would concentrate on the train stations beginning in Berlin, where the refugees are packed, and it will create transportation chaos. Transportation chaos that will disrupt the movement of troops from the western to the eastern front. So what happens then is on February 3rd, an order comes down from Spaatz to Jimmy Doolittle, who's head of the 8th Air Force. And Doolittle actually objects to the order. It's almost an act of insubordination. He feels that this bombing will be military ineffective and morally wrong. We can't go after the guy in the street. And we haven't done it yet. And he also feels, why don't we keep continuing to hit the targets where we're really making a difference, oil and transportation? He urges Spaatz to reconsider. Spaatz, again, figuring that we can disrupt German logistical, the whole German logistical process along this Leipzig-Berlin rail line, orders the mission. The crews knew exactly what happened. They were briefed. As one airman told me, it was going to be assholes and legs. It was going to be women and children treatment. And so they had an idea what was going on here. The mission is flown. I don't know what the casualties were. The Air Force figures are actually higher than the German figures. The American Air Force, the initial figures are 25,000. The Germans are now saying only 3,000. That still would have been the largest Allied raid in terms of numbers of killed in Berlin in the entire war. It doesn't stop there, of course. We mobilize a massive strike on Dresden. And I'm not going to go into detail on that. We'll talk about that a little later. And another operation called Clarion, whereby we send up about 3,500 planes and we sweep across all of Germany. And the idea of Clarion is to strike terror in the hearts of Germans in every part of the Reich, Germans who haven't been touched by the bombing yet. And that, there wasn't an order the order did not come from the White House, but everybody knew where Roosevelt stood on this. And where he stood was this: the Germans had not had a single battle fought on the homeland in World War I. And this put them in a mood for war later. This time, every German must feel the fury of Allied bombing. And so the bombing almost has a political purpose as well. Well, Clarion wasn't very effective. Berlin wasn't very effective. Dresden was. Now, I'll end with that. The Dresden bombing, I think, does show that there was still some difference between the two air forces. We were supposed to go, the Americans were supposed to go in first, but cloud cover grounded the force. The British went in first and set a Gomorrah-like fire that killed about 45,000 people. The 8th Air Force went in later and went after the transportation yards. They used a lot of incendiary bombs. Blast bombs, you usually use blast bombs to go after a rail station to get what they call hardened targets. They used incendiary bombs because they knew the blast bombs weren't accurate, and the incendiary bombs would widen the area of destruction. Maybe the station will burn down. Still, it's bombing aimed at, the aim of the bombing is to ruin a rail system. The aim of the British bombing is to rub out an entire city. So there remained a difference there. Roughly, was Dresden a military target? Actually, the interesting thing is that Doolittle, who opposed the Berlin operation, fully supported the Dresden operation. He saw it for what it was, a direct attack on an important transportation nexus. In addition to that, 50,000, as Frederick Taylor argues in his wonderful book on Dresden, 50,000 people in Dresden were involved in war work. And all the Jews in Dresden had been sent to Auschwitz with the exception of 198 of them. And they were to be sent on February 15th, the day after the bombing. They were to be ordered to be sent to rail stations. They had their slips. Victor Klemmerer, who wrote a memoir about this, had actually carried the message from household to household: pack your things, be at this train station, and be ready for deportation to an unknown destination. Klemmerer escaped the fire and fled, and he and his wife were saved. Other Jews were saved. Jews in a concentration camp that manufactured Panzerfaust right above Berlin. I talked to some of the survivors. They looked out the windows. They said, we were never happy in our lives when we saw that city burning. So, yes, the Americans revert to terror bombing at this point in the war and cross a moral threshold. The moral threshold was supposedly crossed at Tokyo in March, when the American Air Force, Curtis LeMay, orders a raid that kills about 100,000 people in Tokyo, more than were killed in the first blast at Nagasaki. But I think that moral threshold was already crossed in Europe. And as further evidence of it, and to give you an idea of how a negotiated peace in a prolonged war were a Nazi pipe dream, I found some evidence at Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah. At Dugway Proving Grounds, late in the war, what we were doing is we had established a German village and a Japanese, I should say a German neighborhood and a Japanese neighborhood. The one was designed by the famous architect Mendelssohn, and an exile from Hitler's genocide. They bombed these things repeatedly with napalm. And as Secretary of War for Air, Robert Lovett said, if the Germans want to fight a total war, this is what they're going to get. So a prolonged war would have meant for Germany these tremendous Old Testament-like fires, constant napalm bombing, and if the war had been prolonged through August or September, certainly Germany would have been the first to be hit by atomic bombs. When I talked to Paul Tibbets, he said to me, look, I was briefed down at Los Alamos. Be prepared to hit Berlin, be prepared to hit a Japanese city. Paul said, I didn't care which one we hit. I would have preferred Germany because I lost a lot of friends there in the 8th Air Force. And of course, he flew the first mission with the 8th Air Force. So that's the kind of moral dilemma that you have with something like that. And I come down on the side of Thomas Mann, who said, what can the Germans expect when they make a leap to barbarism and they put their own families and their own children in jeopardy by going to war like this? So that's where I'd put the moral responsibility. Thank you.
Okay, get my slides put up, please. There we go. Good afternoon. I'm honored to be here. Glad to be associated with this outstanding panel. And I'm going to continue this slide to total war that Don has begun to talk about by talking about the cigar who ignited the fire wind. This is an image of a B-29s flying by Mount Fujiyama on their way to deliver their fiery loads of death to Tokyo. But this was not a preordained result, even though Japanese vulnerability to fire was common knowledge. For example, okay, how many people out in the audience know what this is? Okay, we have a couple. This is Project X-Ray. I'm going to explain a little bit about Project X-Ray to get this story of Japan and firebombing. Project X-Ray starts with this guy right here. His name is Dr. Lytle Adams. He's a dentist from Pennsylvania. And right after Pearl Harbor, he writes a letter to the National Defense Research Council and says, I've got this idea how to win the war against Japan. If we can train bats to deliver little firebombs throughout Japan, they'll not only burn down Japanese cities, they'll terrify the superstitious Japanese. Now, this gets the National Defense Research Council, and they say, this guy's a crackpot, and they set it aside. But Dr. Adams was a friend of Eleanor Roosevelt. He got a letter from FDR that said literally, and I quote, "This man is not a nut," unquote. And he actually submitted that to Bill Donovan, who was running special projects, and he said, well, the president wants this, so I guess we'll do it. So he funds it. What Dr. Adams does is he grabs his old Buick, which is in this picture, and a bunch of young scientists from the Southwest who had just been drafted, and he goes out, he starts roaming around Texas and New Mexico looking for bats. He needs these things. He needs a lot of Mexican free-tailed bats. That's what he figures is going to be what his biological weapon he's going to use for this. He actually wanders into Plano, Texas, goes up to a bartender in a restaurant and says, I'm looking for bats. And he says, I got the answer for you. He says, you need to talk to the batshit man. And he says, who's the batshit man? He turns around. Everybody in the restaurant is sitting up against the wall of the restaurant, and there's one guy in the middle all by himself. And as he walks towards him, he realizes why he's called the batshit man and why nobody's sitting near him. But this guy says, oh, I know where the bats are, and he leads him to a Frio cave near Plano, which is the largest colony of Mexican free-tailed bats in the world. So now he's got his bats. Next step is he needs a bomb. This guy on the right, his name is Louis Fieser. He is the quintessential mad scientist. He develops an 18-gram napalm bomb that's been carried by a bat. Now the story, this guy on the left, this guy is one of the young men on Dr. Adams' bat crew. His name is Fletcher. He's in a Marine uniform. These guys had just been drafted and never been inducted yet. So they get in a meeting one day, and Dr. Adams says, gee, you guys probably need some ranks and things. What ranks do you want? And they all say, one guy wants to be a first sergeant, one guy wants to be a sergeant. Fletcher wants to be a Marine because he thinks Marine uniforms look better. So Dr. Adams drags out his typewriter and types out orders and signs them Dr. Adams and appoints everybody to the services they want, gives them the ranks they want. More on that when we get a little later. Now, the next problem they got is how you deliver these bats, because they find out that the bats are kind of flighty. It's hard to get the bombs on them. So what you got to do is you got to get them to hibernate. So they get a refrigerated van, and they get the bats to hibernate. Then they take the bats, they sew little bombs on, they take them up in a bomber, and they drop them out of the bomber. Well, you have bats dropping all over Southern California and New Mexico because they don't thaw out in time. So now they've got to figure out a way to deliver the bats so they can freeze them to load the bombs on, but then they got to somehow thaw out on the way down. So they developed this bat bomb where you load them in little like egg crates, like you'll see in the picture there. And they have to be each one has to be hand put in the little egg crates. And then when the bomb drops by parachute, it pops open, the bats kind of sun themselves as it comes down, thaw out, when they get their energy, they fly off and they deliver their little bombs. Actually, when they do tests, they find out that one load of bat bombs is 11 times more efficient than a B-29 load of incendiaries. Now, they have a hard time convincing some of the higher headquarters about it. So what happens is, though, is the Army Air Force loves to film things. So they set up a big demonstration at Carlsbad Auxiliary Army Airfield in New Mexico. They bring out the Army Air Force's film crews. They bring out the general in charge of the West Coast defenses, and they set up a big demonstration. Well, what happens is the Air Force film crew shows up just as the general shows up, and they said, we want to take some pictures of the bats. So they bring these hibernating bats out of the refrigerated van and lay them out in the on the tarmac next to the refrigerated van. Well, it's an overcast day. So the camera guys bring out Klieg lights, so they got more light on the bats. Yeah, you can see what's coming. All of a sudden, the little bats wake up and fly off. The first thing that happens is the general's car goes up in flames. The next thing, the whole airfield goes up in flames. The officers' club goes up, the hangars go up, and what had happened is because it was a top secret project, Corporal Fletcher was at the gate, and all the personnel from the Army airfield had been pushed outside the gate, including the fire crews. And when they tried to get in, he said, "This is a top secret project, you can't come in." So they basically all stood there and they watched the airfield burn down completely. Now, it was a good news, bad news thing. It did prove the concept worked, but it turned the Army Air Forces off about it. So they gave up on the project, but then the Navy decided they wanted it. Marine Lieutenant Colonel shows up and says, "Okay, I'm taking over. Let me see your orders." Doc Adams opens his little briefcase and hands him all these grimy, typed-up sheets that give everybody ranks and services. The Marine Lieutenant Colonel has a heart attack, picks himself up, goes to Washington, and gets them all approved. So everybody gets the rank they want. Everybody wants everything works out fine. The project continues until December 1944, when some accountant in Washington moves all the money from Project X-Ray to the Manhattan Project, and it dies. So we'll never know if Dr. Adams could have won the war or not. There actually is a book by Jack Kalfer called Bat Bomb, which is probably one of the best books on World War II you'll ever find. Why it's not a movie, I don't know. Now let's get into, we'll go from comedy to tragedy. Let's talk about the firebombing of Japan in some more detail. The B-29 is the most expensive development project in World War II. It's even more expensive than the Manhattan Project, about $3 billion going to the B-29. It is the super weapon that's going to win the war for the Air Force. The longest range bomber up to its time, heavy bomb loads, the first pressurized bomber. It's put into combat a year early because Hap Arnold wants to get into combat in time to have an impact on the war. Curtis LeMay said the B-29 had more bugs than the entomological institution of the Smithsonian Institute. It was put in the field too fast. Two major problems with it. Number one is the engines tended to catch fire at high altitude. And the other one was the gunner's cupolas in the pressurized airplane would pop out when it got to high altitude as well. And they would take the gunner with them. Now, both of those things are real bad for crew morale. And a lot of people were losing confidence in the airplane until Curtis LeMay tried to straighten some of those things out. The idea was to deploy these B-29s, though, from two locations. Kurt LeMay, the Air Force's premier problem solver, was going to take B-29s out of China and India, while Possum Hansel, I'll talk about in a second, was going to get the B-29s out of the Marianas. The Marianas had much better targeting. They could get the key targets in Japan much better than the Japanese and Indian B-29s could. The other problem with the B-29s deployed to India and Japan, especially to China, was every time they got a good airfield set up where they could attack Japan, the Japanese ground forces took it back. So it's a very frustrating campaign. It really starts in 44 in India and in China, that by early 1945, the high command in Washington realized it's a failure and everything needs to be concentrated in the Marianas. Now, in charge of the Marianas is this guy, Possum Hansel. He's one of the primary architects of precision bombing doctrine. He's a smart guy, a lot of respect for him in the Air Force, and he's devoted to precision bombing. And he shows up in the Marianas to take care of the 21st Bomber Command there of the 20th Air Force, and he's going to do precision bombing of Japan. But he could not get it to work. The airplanes had too many technical problems. The people weren't trained right. And I'll talk about weather in a second, and the weather made it impossible as well. Some similar problems to what Don's already talked about in Europe. So in January 1945, Hap Arnold decides we're going to fire Hansel, and I'm going to put all the B-29s under Kurt LeMay in the Marianas. Now, Curtis LeMay is the most innovative air commander of World War II. I think he's the best combat air commander as well. We can debate that. He designed the lead crew concept in Europe. He's the one who developed all the bomb boxes for self-defense of the aircraft there. He was known by his men in Europe as Old Iron Ass. He was tough, but he valued the lives of his troops and wanted to make sure they're the best trained they could be. In the Pacific, his nickname was the Cigar, because he always seemed to have one in his teeth. He was the Army Air Force's supreme problem solver. If you want to see images of LeMay in the movies, if you've ever seen the movie Strategic Air Command, the character of General Hawks is based on LeMay. And the one incident is actually based on something that LeMay actually did in India, where General Hawk shows up at an air base. They start to refuel the plane. One of the fueling guy runs up as General Hawks is smoking a cigar by the plane, and he says, "Sir, you can't smoke that cigar. You'll blow up the airplane." And one of the people with General Hawk's character turns to this complainer and says, "It wouldn't dare." Now, LeMay is also the model for Buck Turgidson in the movie Dr. Strangelove. He is not the model for Jack D. Ripper in Dr. Strangelove. That's a guy named Tom Power. I talk about him during question and answer if you want. But the George C. Scott character is a model to some extent on how Stanley Kubrick saw LeMay. Now, LeMay changes, when he gets over there, he changes the staff, he changes the maintenance procedures, he changes training, but he can't affect the weather. What this chart up here just basically shows the weather data he gets from his weather crews. And what they basically tell him is, the only time you get good visibility is in the winter. You might be able to get 5 or 6 days over Japan for good visible bombing. But oh, by the way, during that same time, you've got 200-mile-an-hour winds over Tokyo because of the jet stream. Problem for your bomb crews is that means they're either going over the target at 500 miles an hour, which exceeds any bomb tables, or they're basically hovering over Tokyo if they're going the other way. And crews do not like to hover over concentrations of enemy anti-aircraft guns. So the bottom line is, because of weather, LeMay says, I've got to get under the clouds, and that leads him to look at going to nighttime, going to low-level bombing. If you're going to bomb low-level, you got to do it at nighttime. If you're going to bomb at night, you can't do precision bombing, you got to do area bombing, and that leads him to the fire raids. He has a great cartoonist who writes his orders. And in his report, the cartoonist says, you know, if you've got high-altitude raids, you've got all these dilemmas. You know, what's your wind direction? What's the time of day? How many clouds? But if you go to low altitude, everything's great. You know, this again, these are actually cartoons from LeMay's operations reports. You can carry more bombs at low altitude. You've got better accuracy. You've got more choices of attack. And oh, by the way, the engines don't burn at low altitude. Crews love that. So that's another reason to go in low. But of course, you've changed your tactics. LeMay says, how am I going to destroy these industrial targets? Well, his systems analysts say, you've got to set large enough fires to leap the fire breaks to get to the factories. So here's how many bombs we have to drop to build the fires, to leap the fire breaks to get to the factories. Of course, the kindling for those fires are the residential areas of the cities surrounding those targets. Now, when the first raid on Tokyo goes off in March 1945, this is how it's reported in the New York Times. There's a map with a description of all the targets that are destroyed, the oil terminals, the factories, the markets. That's how things get reported. That's also typical of Air Force intelligence reports. This is what one of those fire raids looks like from the air. Most of the aircraft lost in the March 9th and 10th Tokyo raid are not killed by enemy action. They're destroyed by the updrafts from the fires that literally tear the aircraft apart in midair. This is what Tokyo looks like after the raid. Looks just like the atomic bomb raids. He picks the most densely populated part of Tokyo for his initial raid, the one to make a big demonstration, and he did. At the microcosm, this is what the raids look like. This is a mother and daughter fried on the streets of Tokyo. The people of Tokyo call it the night of the fire wind. Molten glass rolls down the streets. People are boiled to death in canals. When the planes get back, they have to be fumigated to get the stench of burning flesh out of the bomb bays. Over 100,000 dead from one bombing raid in one night. Eventually, LeMay has a press conference in May where he talks about what happened. And he says, by his estimate, by that time he figures he's killed 1 million Japanese in his fire raids. This is at the end of May 1945. I use this newspaper when I teach students about what's going on in the Pacific, though, because on the same page you've got LeMay talking about killing 1 million Japanese in the fire raids, the battle on Okinawa, where you're incinerating Japanese in their caves, and a court-martial of a Navy commander for sinking a Japanese relief ship. So all the standards aren't gone in the Pacific. This particular news report does get the attention of Henry Stimson. who feels we're outdoing Hitler in atrocities. Arnold explains it to him. Stimson does accept the raids, but he complains that he doesn't understand why there's not more public demonstrations against him. Eventually, he says one of the reasons to drop the atomic bomb is to stop the fire raids. Hap Arnold, in his picture with him, thought the fire raids were great. We talked about Carl Spaatz. He goes over to take charge of the bombing in Japan in May, or in July, and tries to change back to precision bombing. But all that's in the bomb dumps are incendiary bombs. That's all the crews are trained to do. He can't change back. But he is very uncomfortable with the tactics. These are some of the headlines in the American papers at the time. Japanese etch grim war plans with suicide as a national weapon. Japan foresees victory and suicide for beaten peoples of the homeland. And the Joint Staff is afraid the American public are losing their stomach for the war. America's midsummer mood, war-weary, restless, and irksome. A lot of pressures building on both sides. LeMay also drops warning leaflets that basically say, we're going to bomb cities in Japan, leave the cities and you'll be safe. He thinks this is a humane gesture. His airmen hate it. They think it gives away what they're going to do. It's also a terror campaign that eventually drives 8 million Japanese to flee their cities. If any of you saw the movie Memoirs of a Geisha, remember that she gets run out to the countryside with many other Japanese from Tokyo. Eventually, LeMay's campaign torches 180 square miles of 67 Japanese cities. Some debate the utility of the raids, but they were a key part of the series of blows that contributed to Japanese surrender. If you look at the intelligence pictures that come in on the raids, they're typical to this. This is a picture from the city of Shizuku. The caption basically says, Shizuku, city of 200,000, was 66% destroyed by the fire raid, but we got the key propeller plant. So they burned down 2/3 of the city to get their one industrial target. And my last slide, and this is a note which is sent to, this kind of describes what's happened to precision bombing doctrine by 1945 when the atomic bomb was dropped. This is a message sent to Spaatz, who is now running the strategic bombing campaign against Japan, from Washington. It is understood that the Secretary of War in his press conference tomorrow will release a map or photostat of Hiroshima showing the aiming point and the general area of greatest damage, all based upon information received from you last night. It is believed here that the accuracy with which this bomb was placed will counter any thought that this was indiscriminate bombing. So what has happened is even the atomic bomb now is seen as precision bombing, with this focus on area attacks, take out precision targets. In fact, the LeMay model becomes the model for atomic targeting after the war, and you'll often see this phrase, we are doing precision attacks with area methods, or with area weapons. And that's the way it becomes perceived. So again, we can talk about crossing these moral thresholds, but there's a definite slide to total war in Japan. But again, I'd say it's a little different than what the British do with their fire raids over the German cities, because it is still focused on destroying industrial targets. In the summer, when Hap Arnold asked LeMay when the war is going to be over, LeMay says the war will be over on 1 October 1945. Arnold is taken aback and says, how do you know? And LeMay says, because by then it will have destroyed every target in Japan. Thank you.
I'm the guy you've been looking for, the last one for the day. Let me start off by a comment on a theme that has run through a large part of today, and that is victimization, or in this case, a different slant on victimization. About 2 years ago, a gentleman from New Zealand, an urban planner by trade, went on an exchange program to Japan. He found himself stationed in the small or modest Japanese metropolis of Kanazawa, which is in western Honshu. After he'd been there a short time, the officials of the city took him aside and said that what they would really like him to do is find out why Kanazawa was not bombed during World War II. This gentleman set forth on what I was impressed with the effort he put into his research, and through the wonders of the internet, he was led around to me because he was told that I had a targeting directive relating to plans for using strategic bombers in August 1945. I replied to him that when I got his message, I said I looked immediately at the directive, and that directive contained the names of only 35 Japanese cities, and Kanazawa was not on the list. And I was sending along a copy of the targeting directive. So in due course, I got a very nice reply from this gentleman in which he explained that, yes, indeed, it certainly confirmed that Kanazawa, as far as the historical record showed, was not going to be bombed in World War II. He said, I couldn't help noticing, however, in going over the list of the cities, that the town of Toyohama was. Toyohama is sort of a rival city of Kanazawa, not very far away, and most pertinently, Toyohama is smaller than Kanazawa. So the gentleman completed his message to me by saying that he was going to deliver his findings to the city fathers of Kanazawa, and that he was quite certain that they would be intrigued and very gratified to learn that, as far as could be ascertained, that Kanazawa was not going to be bombed. However, he added, I'm not sure how they're going to take the news that Toyohama was going to be bombed. This sort of idea of bombing envy, which was an entirely new field as far as I'm concerned, just absolutely flabbergasted me. Now, this targeting directive that I'm going to talk about today is one of the clearly lesser known or unknown stories of World War II, particularly in the Pacific. But in order to appreciate it, we have to go back first and pick up the issue that I call the most ruthless method that the United States contemplated for waging World War II. This did not involve strategic bombing, nor indeed the atomic bombs. It was the Navy's concept of how to fight the Pacific War. The United States Navy had contemplated war with Japan for approximately from 1906 to World War II. In the course of that study, they'd analyzed a war that they thought would come in three phases. The Japanese would initially attack, seize the Philippines. The U.S. would conduct a counteroffensive across the Pacific. It would win a great climatic naval battle. And then in the third phase, the U.S. would conduct an in-game campaign against Japan. Now, when the Navy studied this campaign, this final campaign, very carefully throughout this period, they reached a basic conclusion. And as one wag once put it, that this conclusion was genetically encoded in the naval leadership of World War II. And this conclusion was, and here you'll have to indulge me while I use a technical legal term, naval officers thought you'd be absolutely nuts to attempt to invade the home islands of Japan. They believed that the U.S. could never put an expeditionary force across the Pacific that would outnumber the number of Japanese that they have to confront, and that the terrain in Japan, it was either steeped or soaked, would negate all American advantages of heavy equipment, firepower, and mobility. And therefore, an invasion of Japan would produce totally unacceptable levels of casualties to sustain the American will to see the war through. Therefore, naval officers concluded that the only sane way to end a war against Japan was by a campaign of bombardment and blockade. And they initially were talking about bombardment in terms of ship bombardment from the sea, but by the 1920s, they added aerial bombardment of Japan. Now, ship bombardment, aerial bombardment were means and methods of waging war that were capable of producing casualties in the thousands, tens of thousands, or with atomic weapons, even hundreds of thousands. But the other method that the Navy was contemplated using, blockade, was something that moved by a whole order of magnitude. Blockades had been conducted by naval powers for hundreds of years prior to World War II. They were generally conducted under a rubric of law and custom, however, that applied the blockade against contraband, actual war materials or materials that could be used to build the sinews of war. In World War I, however, the British added food to the targeted items of a blockade. And that blockade against Germany played a major role in the defeat of Germany. It also produced tremendous amounts of casualties in Germany among non-combatants from starvation and the effects of starvation. So when the Navy was contemplating this campaign, they were contemplating ultimately waging a war against Japan that aimed to end it by starving to death or threatening to starve to death literally millions of Japanese. They would be mostly non-combatants. The attack on Pearl Harbor was taken by the U.S. to sanction absolutely unrestricted air and submarine warfare and give sanction to the program of blockade. Now, Let me show you how you properly use a PowerPoint. There we have the appropriate indicator of where we're going now. Can we kill this for right now? I'll just go back to, I'm afraid they'll be still reading that as I talk here or whatever. To understand where we are with respect to Japan, we have to go back over a couple of basic points. Demographics. Although the image of Japan as a teeming island of Japanese is true, the fact was in 1944, 1945, 3 out of 4 Japanese lived on the main island of Honshu. If you drew a line east and west across Honshu just north of Tokyo, the area south of that line contained almost literally 1/2, 48% of the total population of Japan. This was an area of stupendous food deficit. Tokyo being the worst case, about 97% of its food was imported. The food surplus areas were in northern Honshu and to a degree on Kyushu, although even Kyushu had deficit areas. Now, the Japanese had depended over the years to supply their population on supplementing internal production, which was inadequate, with overseas imports, totaling about 15 to 20% of the total calorie intake for the Japanese population. That was about to be totally obliterated by the blockade. The Japanese rice harvest, which had run roughly in the range of 9 to 10 million tons from 1937 to 1944, collapsed in 1945. The total rice harvest came in at about 6.3 million tons. Basically, almost half the normal food supply of Japan was off the table. The fishing industry, which had provided a tremendous amount of the protein intake for the Japanese population, had also been destroyed or disrupted by the war. Consequently, as the Japanese headed into the summer of 1945, they were looking at a catastrophic food situation, and the Japanese leadership knew it. Now, the blockade had proceeded from 1942 on, gathering momentum. U.S. submarines sank about 2/3 of the Japanese merchant marine. In particularly 44 and 45, aircraft added tremendous numbers tremendously to the destruction of Japanese shipping. In March 1945, in one indication of the tremendous flexibility, versatility of Curtis LeMay, he agreed to a Navy plan to use part of his B-29 force for a campaign of aerial mining. These mines were large cylindrical devices that were attached to parachutes. They were dropped by B-29s. They had a variety of fusing devices on them, acoustic, pressure, and magnetic, with all kinds of sophisticated trickery on them to make them very difficult to sweep. And the thing about the mine-laying campaign that made it especially deadly was the fact that because we were reading Japanese codes, all the Japanese message traffic telling how their countermeasures were going, how they were reacting to the mining campaign, was like being read on a daily basis. They would read that the Japanese had just about freed up a port that had been mined and then target that port for a remining effort. The mines also had other things. Not only did they sink ships, they simply blocked the usage of waterways. Most of the Japanese ship repair facilities were along the inland sea, but the mine-laying campaign made it extraordinarily difficult for the Japanese to move ships even to the ship repair facilities, so that ships damaged couldn't even be repaired and made them total losses. The Japanese shipping situation was in a death spiral in the summer of 1945, not merely simply the loss of ships, but also the ability of the Japanese to sustain an organized system of transportation, and by August 1945, it was very near total collapse. Now, this brings us back, with respect to Japan, as the strategic bombing survey done by the United States pointed out, the unique feature of Japan in 1945 was that it was unique among industrialized nations in the world in the sense that its internal transportation system, not simply its overseas trade, import and export, was totally dependent upon seaborne transportation. The whole Japanese transportation system was set up around the premise that goods or commodities would be taken from where they were created or harvested, moved to the nearest port, put on a ship, run around the Japanese coast to the port nearest the point of destination, offloaded and moved inland. With the collapse of the shipping system, the most important and absolutely vital system of Japanese internal communication was about to be completely obliterated. There was no meaningful Japanese road system. there were no roads that any American would recognize connecting any area outside of the immediate large urban areas on the southeastern coast of Honshu. And even if they had roads, they had no trucks, and even if they had trucks, they had no fuel. The only method the Japanese had remaining to move bulk commodities, including bulk commodities of food, was their railroad system. And this brings us back to the new targeting directive. Immediately upon the surrender of Germany, the Strategic Bombing Survey sent over a team to conduct an immediate rapid survey to attempt to determine what was the most effective type of bombing employed against Germany. Con Crane did some really important initial work in finding out about this, and my recollection is Bart Bernstein also did important work about this. Now, the essential conclusion in shorthand for this presentation is that the most effective bombing that could be applicable against Japan was an attack on the railroad system. So when this report was delivered, it was then briefed in Washington, and General Spates, who was coming out to take command of the Strategic Air Forces in the Pacific, was given this directive indicating that the principal target that you should aim for is the Japanese rail system. Now, Spates was going to take over what was essentially a mirror image command in the Pacific to the one he had in Europe. This command, United States Strategic Air Force Pacific, was going to have, was activated on July 16th and was going to have two essential components. One was called the 20th Air Force. This was actually really the 21st Bomber Command, LeMay's command in the Marianas, which was already there and fully equipped and staffed at that point. Coming over from Europe were elements of the 8th Air Force under General Doolittle. The 8th Air Force was being re-equipped with B-29s and also with long-range fighter aircraft. Now, this is an Air Force study indicating roughly what the level of equipment that they were heading for. And what primarily it tells you is, you can see that the fighter force was going to be relatively stable, but you can see the B-29 force building up, which basically tells you the speed with which the 8th Air Force was going to come over and be stationed in Okinawa. Now, obviously, there was a big disparity between the number of aircraft the 20th Air Force were going to be able to launch in the forthcoming months and the number of aircraft the 8th Air Force would be able to deploy. Consequently, that was reflected in the targeting directive. Now, unfortunately, I don't think that's quite as readable as I would like, but the essential thing I wanted to point out to you was that, first of all, up to this point, from about June of 1945, LeMay had been marching down the 180 cities list. And by the end of the war, 66 Japanese cities had been attacked with incendiary attacks or atomic bombs. That left 114. This targeting directive was designed to remove the priority to the urban areas and instead place absolute priority on attacking the Japanese rail system. About 67 of the total 221 targets were in the rail system. As Kahn indicated, there was a problem because they had so many incendiaries in the Marianas, they couldn't make an immediate and total shift at that point. Go ahead and just kill the PowerPoint at this point, if you would, please. I'm done with it. Now, after the war, there were several studies conducted as to what the effects of this would have been or how it would have progressed. Haywood Hansel, who was an expert in this sort of thing, said, well, look, about 600 and plus sorties or whatever here, the B-29s could have knocked out the Japanese rail system in about 2 days, and then there'd be further efforts on down the months. The Strategic Bombing Survey concluded effectively that to knock out the Japanese rail system in 1945 would have required simply making the rail connection between Honshu and Hokkaido by rail ferries inoperative, plus knocking out the rail connection between Kyushu and Honshu, the main island, plus about 6 other cuts along the rail system. What is the study showed would have disposed of the Japanese rail system as an effective unit. I think, as everyone who studied this area knows, one always wants to take a big grain of salt whenever one reads one of these Air Force reports about how effective prospectively the bombing might have been. But there was another aspect about this. All Japanese locomotives ran on coal. All the coal that the Japanese had to run locomotives on came from Honshu and Kyushu. As the war ended, Halsey's Third Fleet conducted strikes against the rail ferry system on Hokkaido, sinking 8 out of 12 of the rail ferries at that point. One later study said that this, in fact, was the most significant strategic blow against the Japanese economy during the entire war. A similar effort to knock out the movement of coal from Kyushu would have required even less effort. In my estimate, had the war gone on for as little as perhaps 2 weeks, maybe less, the Japanese would have been in a catastrophic situation with respect to being able to sustain the population of Kyushu and all the food deficit areas. And a social breakdown would have followed from this, and that this likely would have been far more cataclysmic than the situation that actually devolved upon Japan, even with the atomic bombs. Now, I talk about this for several reasons I want to conclude with. First of all, one of the overarching premises with which the end of the Pacific War is approached by a lot of people is the notion that the atomic bombs were the worst possible way the war could have ended. This, in my view, typically is an assertion. It's not an examined fact. When you look at what was contemplated, maybe the bombs were not the worst possible way. Second, you will frequently find in the critical literature about the end of the war a readiness to quote statements from air and particularly naval officers who, after the war, freely gave statements saying, "We believe we could have ended the war without the atomic bombs." This is presented in the context of suggesting to you that the atomic bombs were unnecessary, and because it's presumed that that was the worst possible way, that therefore these statements condemn the morality of the use of atomic bombs. The people who present you with those quotations, I believe, have not really fully understood what these air and naval officers were actually talking about as their alternative to the bomb. Finally, the leadership in Tokyo, when it sat down in June 1945 and adopted a formal policy, which was a fight to the end of the war, reviewed a documentary presentation about Japan's situation. That documentary presentation made it quite clear to Japanese leaders that if they went on with the war, and even if their strategy of attempting to defeat the initial invasion had been successful, there was a virtual certainty that the Japanese civilian population was going to be plunging into a desperate food situation in 1946, leading to mass famine. The deliverance of the bombs included the fact that it delivered the Japanese population, or a large part of it, from the fate that its own leadership was prepared to contemplate in order to preserve the old order in Japan. Thank you.
Just a short comment on Richard's paper. I think, because of course he does mention it in his wonderful book, Downfall, having looked very closely myself at the transportation plans both in Normandy and then the final transportation plan against the Reich, which very clearly by mid-February of 1945 had cut Germany into pieces that no longer could communicate by rail and move goods, particularly coal, back and forth. It's very clear that by the time we got to Japan, we knew how to do it really, really well, and that it was, I think you're quite correct, going to be a matter of a week or two, and quite literally Japan, from that point on, no matter what we and the Japanese did, that millions of Japanese were going to starve to death. So the droppings of the bombs may well have been a blessing, an enormous blessing in disguise. I think we'll be delighted to take questions if you'll come up to the microphones. I don't know.
Yes, sir. This is more a comment than a question. I visited the museum in Tokyo, the beautiful modern, I think it might be the Ito Museum. And according to what I remember seeing there, and I don't speak or read Japanese, the only aggressive thing the Japanese ever did to the Americans was to try to fly those balloon bombs with firecrackers on them to California in the high winds across the Pacific, and also that the war started in March of 1945 when we firebombed Tokyo and ended when we bombed Hiroshima. And that was all I saw in the World War II section of the museum. Are the Japanese people teaching their children that they really weren't involved in a war where they were at least the initial aggressors?
The shrine, the great shrine in Tokyo, and I can't think of its name right now, Iwakuni Shrine, it's really even worse than that. You go through it, you'll be happy to know the little sign, English translation for what we call the Rape of Nanking was actually an operation carried out by the Japanese army to restore order to a riotous and evil situation among the Chinese. Somewhat of a euphemism. I have one story, and then I'll turn it over to anybody in the panel who wants to add. When I was over in Japan 2 years ago, one of my colleagues at the National Institute for Defense Studies, who pretty much has a Western American view of the atomic bomb, said that the famous Japanese ace, this was in the Japanese newspapers, had been traveling back from Tokyo and been seated behind some teenagers who were talking about their next history lessons. And one of them said, and you know what the book says? It says that we fought a war between, there was a war between Japan and the United States in the 1940s. And the other three said, oh no, you're making it up. So whatever depression that I felt about the complete lack of knowledge in terms of most American high school students about history, just happy to know that the Japanese are going the same direction. Anything you guys want to add?
Well, can you hear me here?
Yeah.
Yeah. The biggest war, intellectual war in Japan is the textbook war. What gets in the textbooks? And it swings back and forth, and it's front page New York Times news, gets over here. But at one of the last textbook wars, a couple of Japanese revisionists who wanted to include the Nanking massacre and, you know, some of the barbaric ways in which the Japanese army fought on places like Tarawa and Iwo Jima, stuff was added into it, and they were about to add it into the text, and there was an active debate, and a guy from the right wing jumped up on the table and shot one of the persons who was going to vote in the right direction on this.
Somewhat of extreme academic debate, yes. Yes, ma'am.
I have a quick question for Dr. Crane or Mr. Frank, or both. With all the detail that you gave us regarding the destruction of Japan and Tokyo and the bombing and how destructive it was, and then also the blockade and how the people were starving, were there not any political overtures being made to Japan saying, look, guys, you're just not going to win, or were they just that deeply entrenched in their thinking that they would never surrender?
I mean, those propaganda leaflets that I showed, I didn't read the text, but they're saying the same thing, that you know, I'll read you that this is what the propaganda leaflet said that LeMay was dropping. Read this carefully, as it may save your life or the life of a relative or friend. In the next few days, the military installations in 4 or more of the cities named on the reverse side of this leaflet will be destroyed by American bombs. These cities contain military installations and workshops or factories which produce military goods. We are determined to destroy all the tools of the military clique which they are using to prolong this useless war. But unfortunately, bombs have no eyes. So in accordance with America's well-known humanitarian principles, the American Air Force, which does not wish to injure innocent people, now gives you warning to evacuate the cities named and save your lives. America is not fighting the Japanese people, but is fighting the military group which has enslaved the Japanese people. The peace which America will bring will free the people from the oppression of the military and mean the emergence of a new and better Japan. There are other things being done where, you know, it's the Japanese people themselves know the hardships that they're undergoing, but it's you know, how much say do they really have in making decisions? They don't. You know, part of the problem with any kind of war termination strategy is you've got to determine who you're trying to influence. And in police states or police with totalitarian regimes, you've got to convince the leadership of that regime and those are really the minds you've got to influence. So the Japanese public knew what was going on, but what little they had been told. But the decision makers that had influence were that small clique in Tokyo that eventually, we all know the story about how eventually the emperor has to intervene to finally make the decision to surrender. And even then, it's a close run thing.
Let me just add, one of the things that I think has been extraordinarily elusive for those who were not in the generation that fought Japan during World War II is to fully grasp just how truly extraordinary in certain dimensions the Japanese were. I don't believe there's any nation state in modern history which created the record that Imperial Japan did, where its service members fought to the death in every skirmish, battle, and campaign throughout the war, in which, in U.S. experience on places like Saipan in the Philippines, and particularly on Okinawa, very large swaths of the civilian population joined their armed forces in preferring suicide before surrender. What is typically overlooked in these debates is the fact that in the spring of 1945, the Japanese government effectively declared that all males age 15 to 60, all females age 17 to 40, had become mobilized as part of a national militia, that they were now combatants. You can work the math on this, and it works out to something, if you add in those individuals of both genders in those categories, plus Japan servicemen, you come something close to every other person walking the soil of Japan was a combatant in the eyes of the Japanese government. The U.S. government had declared that unconditional surrender was the ultimate American war aim. For a variety of reasons, a decision was made that a clarification of what unconditional surrender actually meant had to be given to the Japanese to basically counter Japanese propaganda that unconditional surrender meant extermination, the end of Japan and the extermination of its people. And that was given in what was called the Potsdam Proclamation or Declaration in July 1945. If you read that declaration, in essence it says, we mean no ill towards the Japanese people as a whole, that Japan will continue to exist, that you will be permitted to restore your nation and its economy, but we will hold to account those who have misled you into this war, and we will try war criminals. The government of Australia was ballistic when they read this, pointing out correctly that the Japanese were being offered a set of terms, as the Australians viewed it, a far, far more benign set of terms than had been given to the Germans. So that was the political effort combined with the military effort to attempt to influence decision-making in Japan. But as Con Crane said, the tremendous dilemma the Truman administration faced was every time they tried to deal out a card to what they hoped was a peace party in Japan, that same card, that same concession, acted like gasoline being thrown on the fire of the fundamental idea of the militarists, which was that American morale was brittle and it would be broken. And here, this latest set of concessions is further proof that if we just persevere, their will collapse first.
Yeah. Everything I've read from Truman said that the reason that he determined to drop the atom bomb was because he wanted to save the United States and Japan an invasion of the home island. And yet, from what you were just saying, it would appear that Japan was on the verge of collapse anyway, and therefore it would be unnecessary to drop the atom bomb. Was the Truman administration aware of just how close Japan was to utter collapse? And if they were, was there something else they were afraid of?
Well, I'll take a stab initially at that. I think this whole idea, yes, from our point of view, Japan was close to collapse. It's very clear that from the opening arrival of the Marines at Iwo Jima that the Japanese position was absolutely hopeless, and that had one been facing even the Waffen-SS, that after 5,000 or 6,000 casualties, the Germans would have surrendered. By the time Iwo was over, there are hardly any prisoners at all. We were dealing with, from our point of view, a completely irrational point of view in terms of the Japanese militarists in charge of the government. And they were in charge. They had the guns. They had the military formations. The chances of their agreeing to anything less than an appalling set of terms, which would have left them in control, were about zero.
Directly on point is the fact that in the spring and summer of 1945, radio intelligence, in fact, all sources of intelligence were being examined with respect to the Japanese food situation. It's quite clear when you read that material that the Japanese did not put into a message that we could intercept numbers on the rice harvest and their food situation. The best estimates that were being made by Military Intelligence Division of the U.S. Army was that although the Japanese food situation might not be great, they believed the Japanese had far more food, more than 9 million tons of food available, and that the indications they were reading in the traffic of some disruption of their food situation actually indicated that they were shuffling food around to stockpile in anticipation of the invasion. With respect to the rail bombing, one of the key points about that was it was simply a template being copied from Germany. There was no clear understanding of what the effect of the rail bombing was going to be on the Japanese food situation. In fact, I can tell you that the way I stumbled across this and the connection here was I was actually looking for other things with respect to Japanese post-war records about turn-ins of Japanese weapons and repatriation of troops. But when you started reading those same intelligence files, that was when it really becomes overpowering as to how tremendously distressed the Japanese were with respect to food. I'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow. But there was no clear understanding of that. The general impression was the Japanese would stagger on at least into 46 with respect to their food situation. And that might be the time when the situation might reach a crisis. But they did not see a crisis arising in the short term in the summer of 1945 or even into the fall, or that the rail bombing would have the effect it would prove to have.
Yeah, just as to continue on.
Point on this, which is that the Japanese military did not give a damn how many civilians starved to death. That in fact, they would have been willing to take 6 or 7 million civilian deaths as long as their army stood prepared in Kyushu and in the plains of Tokyo to resist.
More than that, Wick, you know, the incredible thing to me is, I think Richard pointed that out as well, the people, all the Japanese had to do to avoid all this was surrender. Once Saipan was taken, they knew the game was up. And because we could reach them with the bombers. I mean, the commanders in the field in the islands knew that. And the amazing thing is that these leaders were not sitting in a bunker in northern Japan, far away from the bombing. They were sitting right in the middle of Tokyo as it was being firebombed repeatedly. And they saw the carnage. They saw the burned bodies. The emperor made one trip in a car with an armed guard around the city, and that was it. And he'd smelled trouble, social revolution. But that's the unconscionable thing, I think, you know, that is never mentioned, rarely mentioned in debate, that refusal to surrender.
And again, the American planners just saw no sign that they were getting ready to surrender. And to continue on some Richard's point, in beginning in 1946, they were to drop chemicals to destroy the Japanese rice crop. They were getting ready to ship that over to the Pacific. George Marshall was pushing to use poison gas on the invasion of the beaches. They were going to drop, I'm sure Bart has the numbers better, they were going to drop either 6 or 9 atomic bombs to support the invasion of Kyushu. I mean, there was just no sign of any let-up, and there was, if there's anything on the American side, it's an increased escalation in the tactics they're going to use.
This is a war a lot like the Russian front. It's a war of annihilation. It's been turned into that. And the Japanese had to know that we would do anything once faced with the way they fought. We would do anything to win this war in any way possible. And the quickest way would be the best way. And they're fully aware of that.
Yes, ma'am.
The strategist working on this problem of bringing the war to a conclusion, the war in Japan to a conclusion as soon as possible. There's a sense that there's some kind of urgency there. Have you in any of your research considered or found references to the morale crisis, the American morale crisis in the military, and the difficulties of shifting manpower, war-weary manpower from Europe where the war was over, and trying to get those folks to
I guess stuff from Stimson, too.
Yeah,
keep on going.
two things. I mean, the impatience that I tried to describe, I didn't use that word, that led to this brief experiment in Europe with terror bombing, was an impatience brought on by the fact that Marshall didn't feel that that democracies could fight a sustained war for more than 6 years. During this crisis that I alluded to, he also urged, in addition to the terror bombing of Berlin, the terror bombing of Munich. The idea was to shorten the war. At the Allied air conferences in January, the predictions they were making were darker than I indicated. They indicated that if the war continued at the present pace, it would not be over in Germany until December and not be over in Japan until early '48. And that was crushing news. And I think this feeling, is what sets loose the kinds of measures you see here. Measures that are a lot like William Tecumseh Sherman's march through Georgia and into the Carolinas. Marches that are designed to convince the enemy that they have no chance of winning. When you fly an Air Force over a country and the Germans look up, and as one German woman told me, your Air Force flew over Germany, flew over my town as if it was flying over Nebraska. There was no opposition. There was no anti-aircraft fire. There was no Luftwaffe. We were finished. Yet we fought on. After all, what does Nazism have but murder and war? That's all it offers the world. It's not going to surrender that.
Let me add.
Gerhard made that point earlier.
Let me add to this too, is that in fact, of course, whatever the troops in Europe, and I do remember Dick Winters telling me that one of the first things he did after the war was over and volunteers for the Pacific were asked was to go down and volunteer, which certainly indicates a certain mentality among the paratroopers. That in fact, troops coming from Europe were going to be the second wave, probably for Olympic. We had more than enough troops in the Pacific, and I would highly recommend to the people in this audience, if you haven't seen it already, you should. Victory in the Pacific, which stars these three gentlemen here, which I think is one of the finest, and actually Bart Bernstein as well, one of the finest analyses of the horror of the Pacific War and the fact that it really wasn't going to end without something really shocking the Japanese out of their complacency that the proper path of Bushido was to go down in a glorious death for the emperor.
Just two comments. One is on the troops. Stimson writes some things in his memoirs about he goes over to Europe and is really disturbed by the attitudes he gets from the troops in Europe that, we won our war. Why do we have to go and fight another war in the Pacific? And he gets, again, that helps spur some of Stimson's support for the atomic bomb and some other things. There also is a great sense within the Joint Chiefs of Staff that the American public is losing their willpower. And you can see some of that in the things that go around the summer. Ernest King especially is very bothered by what he thinks the American public's about ready to fold and offer terms to the Japanese. He doesn't know if they can stick it out. So there are two aspects of the morale problem that are starting to raise their head by the summer of 1945.
And there's a tremendous practical morale issue. The War Department had properly recognized that as soon as Germany surrendered, the American people would reason that, look, we had effectively about 12 million men under arms. At the time we were fighting Germany and Japan. Germany is now off the table. Manifestly, we don't need the same number of service personnel that we needed to fight in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. They therefore came up with a point system to permit people who had longest service, most arduous service, to entitlement to an immediate discharge. The problem with this point system was it absolutely ravaged the units in Europe and units in the Pacific, because the people with the highest points typically were the most experienced people, the non-commissioned officers, a lot of the junior officers. One of the divisions redeploying from Europe, for instance, in the entire division artillery command, the only individual left who would still be eligible to go to the Pacific was the division artillery commander. Every single other officer in that division artillery command was entitled to go home. And there was, you can read the papers where they're tremendously concerned about, Eisenhower says it'll take 6 months to restore these units to combat the combat effectiveness they had on VE Day.
Yes, sir.
John Lewis Gaddis said about the revisionists and the Cold War that the books really told you where the author stood on the Vietnam War. And I'm wondering if you don't see the same thing among American authors about bombing, because Richard Overy, who's not here, is really one of the leading edge of scholars who looked at it objectively. And I'm just wondering if there's a presentism that's involved in this from American authors.
Well, I think there is. When I was examining the strategic bombing surveys for Europe, one of the key authors, this was mentioned this morning by someone else, was the economist John Kenneth Galbraith. And, no, that was yesterday. We were talking about that. And Galbraith, I think, in his opposition to Rolling Thunder in Vietnam, began to argue in the press that strategic bombing wasn't working in Vietnam. And he went on to say that it hadn't worked in Korea, and nor had it worked in northwestern Europe. And he said, I was part of the strategic bombing survey. I wrote the key volume on the effect of bombing on the German war economy, and it didn't work. The first thing I did before I piled into the 108 volumes of the strategic bombing survey and actually read the things was to read Galbraith's report. It doesn't say that. It argues that beginning in August of 1944, the 8th Air Force and the 15th Air Force began to deliver unrecoverable blows to the German economy. And as Wick pointed out yesterday, put a ceiling on production: 36% fewer tanks, 30% fewer aircraft, 30% fewer trucks, preventing Germany from becoming an economic superpower. Well, you shift through the survey, and yes, it's an Air Force document and things like that, but a lot of the surviving documents on the economic impact of the bombing bear it out. So I think there's a lot of this. And then I read the transcripts of Galbraith's interview with Albert Speer at the end of the war, and in which Speer says, well, this is the greatest lost battle of the air war for Germany. And while the British, in a sense, put us in jeopardy, you stabbed us in the heart. Galbraith, that's right in the transcript, and yet Galbraith wrote an article about the interview with Speer, and it doesn't appear in there. And I really had chewed my, I kind of, grew up in college intellectually on Galbraith's book. I liked the affluent society and the new industrial state, and I had a lot of respect for him. And after this, I had no respect for him.
Tomorrow, I think, in the presentation that'll accompany the film, we're going to get into some of these things about the interesting history of the ideological divisions over the use of the bomb and the evolution of the viewpoints from different perspectives as to how the bomb has been viewed. Suffice it to say that if you have gone back through the history of this history, you may be well surprised to find out where people stood in 1945 and where people stood in 1975. And there's all kinds of currents that go on within this period that are a lot more complex and have a lot more origins to them than simply Vietnam. But I think, in my view at least, it's clear that the controversy reached sort of a critical boil in terms of putting aside a prior rough consensus concurrent with Vietnam, and got tied up in many of the ideological issues that are related to that, and are still with us today.
Yes, sir.
How much with the Truman administration's concern of possible Soviet mischief in post-war Japan, did that play a role in his decision to drop the bomb when they did? Because I know the Soviet Union had just declared war on Japan a couple days before the bomb was dropped, and just wondering if the desire to keep maybe the Russians out of northern Japan, if that had played a part in his decision to drop it when he did.
That'll make a fine session on Monday.
Well, actually, the first bomb was dropped before the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. At least since I'm not going to be here, from my perspective, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria added to the pressures on the Japanese government, but the bomb was the primary, I think, device that pushed the Japanese over the edge. And we dropped the bomb. Yeah, there were some people in the Truman administration that said, we really need to send a signal to the Russians, blah, blah, blah. But in fact, that wasn't the major focus. The major focus was we had a Japanese problem that was a really big problem. And let me say, in terms of unintended effects, I would argue that one of the things that kept nuclear weapons from being used during the Cold War was the fact that they were used at Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and by 1953-54, scientists were discovering the incredible impact of cancers and post use of the weapons. And I would argue that one of the things that kept American and Soviet statesmen from using nuclear weapons in the period of the Cold War was the understanding that actually the bombs indicated very clearly by their use at Hiroshima and Nagasaki that they were something very, very different.
You know, I found documents from American airmen who thought that Dresden would be a good, would intimidate the Russians. I mean, there are elements in the Pacific too that do see the bomb as a way to maybe make the Russians more pliable, but it's never a primary reason for what happens. It's, you know, we always ask the wrong question.
That's also in the Berlin debates. At the very end, they say, well, with Yalta coming, that'll also give the Russians an edge, a nudge here, when the real issue is getting those railroad yards knocked out, and that dominates the whole debate in the minutes.
I mean, again, it's this presentism thing. You know, for one generation, you know, the atomic bomb ends World War II. For another generation, it starts the Cold War. And,
you know, it's how historians read a document. Now, you take an air commander's meeting. It's a 2-hour meeting. You have the full minutes of the meeting. You're reading it as an historian. We've all done this. And they drop in one thing at the end there where one person says at the end as a postscript, yeah, that'll also, you know, help to, you know, nudge the Russians a little bit. You pull that out and you say, there it is. You put a date on it, you put a quote in your book, and there's your evidence that it was all about the Russian situation.
In a nutshell, I think it's the phrase I like best is one that Barton Bernstein has used, that the prospect that using the bombs would have some relationship to the future state of relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was the bonus. It was not the primary, not the driving reason. Tashi Hasegawa has commented at one point, at least, that I've heard him say that even if there had been no Soviet Union, U.S. leaders would have used atomic bombs in August of 1945. And this gets back to one other point I want to touch on. One of the things about the way the controversy has evolved compared to where it was decades ago is, I would hope, that we're beginning to get a better grasp of what was the ultimate American nightmare. And it's usually talked about as the, quote, invasion of Japan. But when you go back in 45 and look at what leadership was talking about, like the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in April of 45, they block out what I think is really what describes what the nightmare is. And they say our goal is unconditional surrender. The two obvious problems are that no Japanese government in 2,000 years has ever surrendered. And secondly, no Japanese unit has ever surrendered in this war. Therefore, there is no guarantee that either we can get a Japanese government to surrender, or even if we can get a Japanese government to surrender, that the Japanese armed forces will comply with that surrender. And that whole issue, which is, I think, glossed over too much in this debate, there's the assumption that the emperor intervenes, it's all over. Well, there's a lot more complex sub-story going on with respect to the Japanese units complying with that surrender, and a very deep issue, actually, both in Tokyo and Washington, of doubts about, even if the emperor intervenes, will Japan's armed forces, some 4 to 5 million strong, that's what we thought, it was like more than like 6 million, formally uniformed armed forces, will they comply with the surrender? Or will we be faced with the prospect of defeating Japanese piecemeal in the home islands, the Asian continent, across the Pacific? And Stimson talks directly about this to Truman on the 10th of August 45. He says, Mr. President, if we can't get an organized capitulation, we could be facing the prospect of a score of bloody Iwo Jimas and Okinawas across China and the New Indies. That's a number that runs like between 600,000 and just under 1 million for casualties outside of the Japanese home islands. That is the ultimate nightmare, not the invasion is defined as this initial two-phase, initial invasion of Japan going to Kyushu in November 45 and around Tokyo in March of 46.
And as a spin-off on that, from another subject I've been involved with a lot lately, which is occupations, when MacArthur makes the decision the troops to take and occupy Japan, That's his great nightmare, and that's why he takes in 27 divisions to occupy Japan, because he's not sure they're really going to go along with the surrender.
Professor Weinberg.
It tends to be forgotten, just an incidental, that it was Stalin who urged Truman to drop a bomb just as soon as we had one. The Russians, too, preferred to have the war end. But two things. In the British records, there is an instruction from Churchill reminding cabinet members and others, please not to talk about the war ending in 1948. The assumption was that that would not be good for morale. There is, and this is an aspect that I think tends to be overlooked but was referred to in a way just now, and that is reference in the discussion between the chiefs of staff of what is referred to as post-coronet operations. The invasion of Kyushu was Olympic. One March 46 was coronet. There was clear belief on the staffs that after successful invasions and occupation of the home islands, Japanese forces on the mainland and on the islands would continue to fight, and there was great concern in the post-coronet discussions that the parts of China that Japan still occupied included substantial industrial areas, that therefore Japanese forces continuing to fight on the mainland of Asia would in fact be able to replenish weapons, ammunition, etc., etc., etc. And as I mentioned earlier in response to a question, one of the reasons for saving Hirohito had been the hope, not the certainty, but the hope that if he was kept, the Japanese assured that he and the institution would be kept, some kind of surrender procedure could be implemented. We know now that it was, but as has just been said, lots of people were terrified with excellent reason. There's one other final point that no one has touched on, which I think is terribly important. We had discovered by August 45 that the Japanese government had issued orders for all Allied POWs to be killed rather than allow them to be liberated. And in the Philippines, on the island of Palawan, one of the local commanders had already implemented that order. And furthermore, outside a number of the POW camps where British, Australian, and Dutch forces were kept, they were already digging large places for mass graves in the summer of 1945. Our government, especially after the Palawan experience, was aware of this the way they were not aware, as was just mentioned, about the food situation in the home islands.
One of the men who might have been killed is sitting in the front row, Lester Tenney. Lester was in a camp and within sight of the blast at Nagasaki. And he had been moved there from a camp in the Philippines, and he would have been part of the final solution, as he writes about in his eloquent book, Hitch from Hell. Thank you, Lester.
Just a brief question. Can you comment on Unit 741 in Japan, as well as the evolution of Hirohito's thinking towards the subject of war termination, the whole Imperial Household Agency's view of this? I know Herbert Blix has dealt a little bit about this, but I just wonder if you'd care to elaborate on those themes. Thank you.
Well, I don't want to go into I mean, we've had enough death, destruction, beating, and killing here. I mean, these were horrible mental experiments where they're taking the cone off the top of a man's head and filling it with chemicals, where they're trying to test, how long human beings can survive in freezing water, and they're dipping human beings in the water. They're opening the veins of people and see how fast you can die from loss of blood. They're slipping poisons into the body to test it. All this is done with government sanction, and it's bestial.
Yeah, one of the
What are you going to say?
worst things about that, though, is the U.S. government strikes a deal with the Japanese after the war.
Yeah.
To get their data, and most of the Japanese are pardoned that were involved in it, and a lot of them actually become important figures in the Japanese medical community after the war.
One of the guys, believe it or not, became head of the Japanese blood bank after the war.
I think it also explains, since we were silent about 731, why the Chinese communists in Korea felt we were using germ warfare against them.
Well, that's a part of it. If you go, that's another thing I've done a lot of work on. That's part of the justification for making the accusations is based on the deal that's struck and the sense that we're using their material, which we actually weren't.
Well, I think we've exhausted everybody, including ourselves.
I just have one more, but yes. The issue of what the emperor thought, what did he know and when did he know it, what did he decide and when did he decide it, why did he decide it? This area has been one of the areas that's been tremendously enriched by scholarship over the last, pull a number out of the air, 20 years or so, starting in Japan, continuing here with Herbert Blix, John Dower. There was an image of Hirohito that was propagated for the purpose of maintaining his seat on the throne after the war, that he was sort of this passive, oh, woe is me bystander, just sort of the hopeless captive of a political system in which he ruled but did not reign. It was actually Japanese historians, I think, who first struck the strongest blows against that by showing, for instance, that Emperor Hirohito was briefed to his eye teeth throughout the war about what was happening. After the war was over, he wrote a document. I won't go into all the controversy about that, but essentially it was his version of what happened. What really was shocking in Japan when it was published was the fact that the document, in one important part, essentially confirmed that the emperor had bought into the basic strategy the militarists were pushing, which is for one final decisive battle against the initial invasion. The emperor was fully vested in that idea through May, towards the end of the Okinawa campaign. Only when the prospect of complete defeat on Okinawa loomed up did he turned to an alternative. And that first alternative, interestingly enough, was that what Japan needed to do was launch a new offensive in China. And then he admits that he was basically rebuffed by Imperial Army officers on this. He then, in June and July, clearly begins to try to activate a diplomatic effort to get Japan out of the war, but not a surrender as we would view it. It would be a negotiated end that still would preserve the old order and still would preserve his seat on the throne. Throughout this period, after May, clearly his principal calculation seems to be to preserve the imperial institution, preserve his own position. We can do a whole essay on what influenced it, and in tomorrow's session I'll talk a little bit about one very interesting facet about that I think the more recent scholarship shows. But he clearly was much more of an active player in this. He was not, however, in a situation like he was a Hitler or someone else like that who truly was able to basically completely call the shots. As Ed Dre has pointed out, he sure made a lot of suggestions, but you have to also notice that a lot of his suggestions weren't followed or obeyed. So he is in this limbo land where his will is not automatic, which also gets to the issue of, are we going to have an organized capitulation or not?
Just to add a little bit to Richard's comment is, of course, the idea that somehow the Japanese were really interested in serious diplomatic negotiations in June and July is pointed out by the fact that their ambassador to Moscow basically replied with, "Are you guys nuts? This is not even going to open discussions with the Americans." Yes, sir, Governor Wilson.
Excuse me. In the novel, The Emperor's General, General Yamashita is portrayed as a scapegoat not only for General MacArthur, but for the emperor. And in fact, it is the theme of the book that Yamashita is the sacrifice to avoid bringing to account culpable members of the imperial family. Could you comment on whether or not that is simply fiction that should be treated as fiction, or is there any legitimate historical basis for it?
I might point out that the author of the novel is now a United States Senator from Virginia.
Yeah, I think he's going to be more useful as a senator than as a historian, as a matter of fact. Now, Ed Dre made what I thought was an extremely acute observation a number of years ago about Hirohito's situation. Right at the end of the war, when the Japanese are basically, you read this traffic, it's fascinating, because basically the emperor says, I want the government to surrender, want Japan to surrender, and almost immediately they get messages back from the senior Japanese commander in China and the senior Japanese commander in what they call the southern area, which is like Southeast Asia and to that area. And these men between them command between a quarter and a third of all the Japanese armed forces, and their message is, hell no, we won't go. And there is this very tense period that exists when they're trying to assure the organized capitulation. The Imperial Navy, in order to facilitate that, sends out this all-hands-or message, which basically describes the deadlock in Japan among the leadership and the fact that the emperor himself personally intervened to order the surrender. And as Ed points out, this was a situation which we didn't have to depend upon what they told us later had what happened, or their accounts or versions that we could doubt or have any suspicions about. Here was delivered up to us with unimpeachable authenticity, evidence that the emperor had been absolutely vital in ending the war. And Ed argues, and I agree, that this was, I think, critical in framing the attitude of American officials about what to do with Hirohito. And when the Japanese armed forces did comply, and there was a very iffy period when I'm sure the guy who was sweating the most bullets was probably Hirohito, because I think he clearly perceived that if there's a major breakdown in the surrender by the Japanese units, it would prove that his authority was not what it was purported to be, and therefore his value was not what they were going to represent to us. And that's probably what was an absolutely crucial item that helped make the decision to preserve the emperor. But it was something that nobody could talk about because it came from radio intelligence, which was absolutely secret and was not supposed to be talked about in any way, shape, or form.
You know, when this decision was made, invasion, atomic bomb, things like the United States had already gone through this. They had already dealt with a nation that had been defeated but would not surrender, and that nation was Germany. And Germany, it's rarely mentioned, and Germany was finished after the Battle of the Bulge, and the German economy was shattered. There was no Luftwaffe, the Kriegsmarine were done, but they wouldn't surrender. And this is a country that fought with less suicidal resolve than the Japanese. And in order to defeat them, we had to utterly annihilate them. And don't think the commanders didn't have that on their mind when they're looking at the Japanese theater.
We have one more question, please.
You mentioned before that there was talk in Germany, even at the end of the war, about how we were all victims, we're part of the victimhood. Any kind of similar thoughts among the Japanese decision makers, you know, post-war, like right after the war, that, hey, we're victims here? Could you comment on that for anyone on the panel?
I didn't quite catch what he said.
Victims?
Japanese have a
victimhood?
sense of victimhood.
Victimhood.
I would argue that Japanese, in terms of the response of substantial portions of Japanese society towards Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is that they were these enormous victims of these horrible weapons that spread death and destruction throughout their target area. I was at a conference on air power 3 years ago, where at the end of my discussion said that it was probably the best thing that could have happened to both the United States and Japan that we dropped the bomb. My Japanese hosts, actually, the academics at National Institute for Defense Studies, thanked me because they said, we wouldn't dare to say something like that, which is, I think, a very serious comment about the attitude still in Japan towards the ending of the war. Okay, well, thank you all very much. This is a very, very interesting section.